Hi, Tim. So nice to see you.
Great to be here, Hunter. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Would you like to just say a quick few words about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I guess simply put, for the purposes of what we're doing here, is that I'm a scholar and a teacher and an activist. I'm a middle-aged queer, and I'm still here. And some people have gotten used to it, not everybody.
Mhm.
I've
Yep.
been a movement activist my whole adult life, as well as a scholar and a teacher. And I take all those things very seriously. I don't see them as in tension necessarily with one another, certainly not in contradiction. As Walt Whitman once said, do I
Mm,
contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. And so there you have it. So let me just
love
leave
it.
a little quote from the queer bard from the 19th century, who I think put into words many years ago how I tried to sort of see myself and live my life.
Your course at Harvard references Queer Nation. We'd love to hear from the horse's mouth. Who are they? And how are they related to the organization that I think a lot of us really know about, which is ACT UP, one of the major LGBTQ organizations at that time?
So I'm really flattered that you referred to me as the horse's mouth. Sometimes I'm referred to as a horse's ass. But for the purpose of this, yeah, Queer Nation is the name of my course. I teach a course that's cross-listed at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Harvard Graduate School of Education. The full title of the course is called Queer Nation, LGBTQ plus Protest, Politics, and Policy in the United States. And when I designed the course in collaboration with my students and other folks that I was in conversation with, I really wanted to offer a course that would delve deeply, but also broadly, into the history and politics of the modern LGBTQ plus movement and community. When I came up with Queer Nation, it was really, in my mind, and I say this to my students, a tribute to the moment in history, or a moment in time, where I came of age. I came of age during the AIDS crisis. I graduated from high school in 1989. I graduated from college in 1993. And one of the first things that happened to me when I went to college was I started to encounter people who were out and proud. Several of the folks I met when I first got to school were activists, were AIDS activists, were HIV and AIDS activists, and folks who were involved in community organizing and social justice work more broadly. And I was really, even though I was not out, I was deeply in the closet at the time, I was really moved by them and their energy, which ultimately I did come to fully embrace, both the queer identity and also the energy, the political energy of that moment. And so one of those people, Jarrett Barrios, actually, who used to be the head of GLAAD, and was a state senator here in Massachusetts, also one of the people who led the fight for marriage equality and other LGBTQ rights struggles in Massachusetts at the level of politics and policy. Jarrett was one of the first people I met when I got to Harvard, and he was a member of Queer Nation. In fact, I think he was the head of the local chapter, the student chapter.
Mm.
So I first heard Queer Nation when I was a first-year student at Harvard right at the beginning of the 1990s. And Queer Nation, of course, was founded in 1990 in New York City, but then there were chapters that proliferated, much like ACT UP, and I'll talk more about that in a second, across the country. And so Queer Nation was one of those groups. First of all, it was a group that was reclaiming the word queer, which had historically, or has historically, and still does in some ways, carry a kind of denigration, right? It's a smear. It's a term that's used to malign and marginalize and mischaracterize, frankly, an entire population of people. So Queer Nation, the folks who founded that, who were many of them young, they were radicals. They come of age during the AIDS crisis. Some of them were members of ACT UP, including some of the founders of Queer Nation. These were folks who were confrontational. They were committed to direct action and civil disobedience. They were trying to reclaim the word queer as a positive word, as a term that we could embrace in our own community. And it became more common to do so, in part as a result of the actions that Queer Nation came to embrace. A couple of things that I think are notable about them. One is that they were very much focused on a kind of broad range, but a set of goals around the eradication of prejudice in the media, anti-LGBTQ prejudice in the media, and also the rising levels of anti-LGBTQ violence in society. They were in some ways most famous for their slogans. They have a number of slogans that I love. One, of course, is probably something you have heard before. Many people have: "We're here, we're queer, get used to it." Another one of their slogans was "Out of the closets and into the streets," right? So that this kind of visibility, but also the militancy of their strategies. They also had a chant that they would often say, which was 2, 4, 6, 8. How do you know your kids are straight? Another one to kind of provoke people who are uncomfortable about queer people being their children. They had banners and posters and so forth, and sometimes they would unfurl, particularly in the face of anti-LGBTQ violence. They would unfurl posters and banners that said "Dykes and fags bash back." So they were both in terms of their tactics and strategic orientation, but also in terms of their public performance and spectacle, very confrontational. And you can see that in the slogans. But they also were trying to reclaim the word queer as a term of political power rather than of prejudice or denigration. One other thing that I wanted to mention about Queer Nation that I think is important is that they weren't just confronting sort of oppression and the powers that be and the abuse of power. They were also claiming space. Right, those slogans, those posters, that visibility was all about claiming space. But they also took over and kind of occupied spaces that had not previously been queer. So they had one approach was a kind of queer nights out, which is a predecessor, I think, to Guerrilla Queer Bar, where queer people kind of take over a straight bar or a non-LGBTQ centered or friendly space and sort of say, "Hey, we're here, we're queer, get used to it." That was another tactic. Again, in line with this confrontational civil disobedience, out and proud politics of Queer Nation itself.
What do you think are some of the top accomplishments of Queer Nation in their partnered organizations?
One of the most important things, certainly culturally in terms of language, is the embrace of queer as a term of power. I mean, the fact that, my students, right, are so that they talk about being queer all the time, like queer is sort of where they begin. And I think for my generation, we got used to that over time, in part because of organizations like Queer Nation and ACT UP and others that were around when we were coming of age. But I certainly, as someone who came out a little bit later, I came out in my late 20s and early 30s. I was raised in a working class Irish, Italian, Catholic home. I was an athlete as the only grandchild. So I had a lot of stuff going on. And it took me a while to come out. I was not comfortable in who I was and in the communities and groups that I ultimately have now become very much part of. And so the embrace of queer was something that I think took time to sink in, not just in society more broadly, but within the community itself. So that's one major accomplishment. I also think that the confrontational tactics, this sort of high visibility and representation of activists in Queer Nation and in ACT UP, though provocative and controversial in some ways, really did push the envelope and push us forward in a more accelerated way, right? Every movement, every community, every moment in history needs the people who are willing to push the envelope, to be hated, right? So that they can push the door open, not ask for the door to be opened, right? To push the door open and make demands of society and of people in order to push that change forward. And I think Queer Nation was really wonderful in its ability to force that. And I think even in the tactic of outing, which was certainly controversial, still is in many ways. And I'm not someone who necessarily practices that tactic, but I also do believe that the confrontation of the hypocrisy of someone who is closeted, who is doing work to oppose LGBTQ rights and people is an advance, is something that we need to do more of, right? I mean, there's nothing more tragic than a member of your own community acting against the interests of, and the rights of that community. And Queer Nation understood that in its bones and confronted that head on.
Why is Stonewall so significant? We celebrate Pride around the anniversary of it, and so much of LGBTQ history is focused on it.
Stonewall is a marvelous moment in the history of the movement. It was a remarkable moment, but it was a moment. I mean, in terms of Pride and Pride Month, there's a reason why Stonewall takes up so much space, because the first liberation marches, as they were called. They weren't called Pride Parades. They were called liberation marches. The Christopher Street Liberation Day March was in June on the 1-year anniversary of 1970 of Stonewall. And so Pride itself, both of the kind of phenomenon of being proud, being out, and so forth, but also Pride as an event where people come together and sort of mark and march and celebrate and do all sorts of things, is directly related to Stonewall. So whenever we talk about Pride and Pride Month, we're talking about an anniversary, a marking of the anniversary of Stonewall. But beyond that, I think Stonewall takes up a lot of space because Stonewall means many things to many people. And that means that it's both kind of full of embrace, that many people embrace it, but it also means it's a contested space in terms of its many meanings. That, Stonewall was a space in a place. It was a mafia-owned gay bar in the West Village. So it was a space that people would go to drink and to let loose, but importantly, to dance. There weren't a lot of places where queer folks could dance with each other. And so Stonewall was that place. But that space of Stonewall was itself contested. As I said, it was mafia-owned. It wasn't run by the LGBT community. It wasn't our bar. But it was a bar where we could go. And it was in a place, New York City, Greenwich Village, Sheridan Square, that was itself very important as a community where LGBTQ people were concentrated across lines of race and class and other forms of difference. And so it's very meaningful in that way, right? As so many of those spaces and places were during a time of enormous persecution and discrimination and violence, frankly. Mm-hmm. So Stonewall means a lot to a lot of people for those reasons. It also means something because that moment was, and it's important to remind people this, it was a sustained, violent act or acts of resistance over 6 days to the powers that be, in part the police, right, principally. And that's something I think is really important to people. It's something that often gets downplayed sometimes when we talk about the movement, like Stonewall is like this fabulous movement of resistance, but it was violent resistance, which gets back to all the debates about who threw the first brick, who threw the first punch, who threw the first Molotov cocktail. Right? This was a sustained act of violent resistance against the violence of the state. And the way in which the mafia, which controlled the bar, was in cahoots, corrupt cahoots with the police and the alcohol authority and so forth. Stonewall was not the initiator of the movement. It was more of an accelerator for the movement. That's how I like to think about it. That it was an important movement moment that means lots of things to lots of people. But what it did was it set in motion, much faster motion, right, the growth and proliferation of organizations. There were something like 50 or 60 gay and lesbian organizations at the time of Stonewall. And by the time that Christopher Street Liberation Day March took place in June of 1970, there were 1,500 organizations. So you see an incredible proliferation of movement organizations, of movement energy, of public protest, of more people coming out. And one of the other things about Stonewall that's really important, and this too sometimes gets downplayed or whitewashed, is that over those 6 nights of violent resistance and protest at Stonewall, many people were there. It was an incredibly diverse crowd. And so it wasn't just a crowd of all white people or of all gay men or of all cisgender folks, of all people of a certain kind of class, but it was everybody. It was people of every race and ethnicity, every gender and sexuality, every type of profession, from lawyers to sex workers. It was lots of different kinds of people, which makes telling a neat story about Stonewall so challenging and I think actually unproductive. I'm fine with the history of Stonewall being a bit of a mess because Stonewall was a bit of a mess. The people who were at Stonewall at 1:20-something a.m. in the morning on June 28th of 1969, I'm sure those folks were not, I mean, when's the last time you were at a bar at 1:30 in the morning? Right? We're not, we're a little messy at that time. Yeah. That's okay. They're dancing, they're getting their drink on, their groove on, their whatever on. And that was the context within which Stonewall happened. And it exploded. And that kind of explosion was really, really important. And one of the reasons why, we now embrace this idea that the first Pride was a riot is because all of that is something that we can now claim as part of our ancestry, as part of our history that has given rise to all sorts of things and also rose from lots of other things. There's an entire, what we might call a prehistory of Stonewall that's no less important, right, to the building of the movement and the community and our sense of ourselves and the diversity within our ranks. That's at least as important as the moment of Stonewall and the subsequent history that we are all part of today. The thing about it is that we, right, the community, the LGBTQ community, had to protect itself in that moment, that relatively safe space of relative liberation where we could get our drink on, our dance on, and et cetera, right, became a violent space in that moment of police raid, of police violence, of arrest, of beatings. And it required the community to rise up and protect itself. And that's a really important lesson too. That's an incredibly empowering lesson, as treacherous as that time was, and as violent, as pervasive as the violence was during that period of time, right? Like, folks rose up and took care of themselves. And that's something that is true of our history too. We were a despised people for most of history. We're still a despised people. And that doesn't mean we can't have allies. It doesn't mean that other people don't care about us or should care about us. It just means that we have to have our own backs, which is one of the things that I think poses a challenge to a movement like the LGBTQ movement, which is so diverse, right? Because there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of differences that we have to wrestle with and reckon with, that I think sometimes gets in the way of that collective effort that we have to remember was both a form of resistance and a form of protection. So there's all the debate about, speaking of violence, about who threw the first punch, the first brick, first Molotov cocktail, and which came first. So we're never going to know who's the first one and which order they came in.
Yep.
But we do know that bricks were thrown and Molotov cocktails did appear, and there were punches. And different people both are identified as having done that. And then there's been a big argument, right? Like, that some people want to say, oh, Sylvia Rivera threw the first brick. Well, Sylvia Rivera wasn't there the first night, right? So chances are, if a brick was thrown on the first night, it wasn't Sylvia who threw it. That doesn't mean Sylvia Rivera wasn't incredibly important to the story, right? And she and Marsha P. Johnson actually have really conflicting stories. It's actually, there's some entertaining parts of how they very much remember things very differently. It's not really important, right, that we know who threw what and which order it came in, because what matters is that those things all happen and that they mark, as I said, a violent kind of resistance, as opposed to, or in addition to, a peaceful demonstration of civil disobedience, which other folks were engaging in, right? So that too is part of the messiness of the story if we try to tidy it up. But my favorite part of the whole thing is that people started to throw pennies. The pennies were meant they represented, at least for me when I think about it, two things. One is that what are pennies made of? They're made of copper. And so the pennies were being thrown at the cops. And then the other meaning of the penny is that, like, we only got pennies because the mafia is screwing us with these overpriced and watered down drinks. And we got to put our coins in the jukebox to get the music that we're dancing to. And so we're being economically exploited and extracted at the same time that we're being raided and arrested and all of these kinds of things. And so the throwing of the penny, which ain't going to kill anybody, a penny's not going to kill anybody, but it also ain't going to pay for a drink. But it's symbolic, right, of the police violence, the copper penny and the police violence, and plus the penny, right, of a community that is marginalized and subjugated in various ways, including, for many of us, socioeconomically. So I love the penny needs to make an appearance in all the Stonewall stories.